We're going to do a short lecture here on the New South for just those of you who didn't understand from the in-class activity. And there is one section in your book, section 3 in chapter 19, page 659 to 663. So the South, although it's 1877 and you have the removal of federal troops from the South and the formal end of Reconstruction, the South is in no way fixed or solved. They have legally re-entered the issue, but there's still a lot of serious and economic issues to contend with. And so Southerners like Henry Grady envisioned a new South, and that's what this new South is, that would take advantage of the region's resources and become a manufacturing center. They want to get rid of the old early 19th century pre-Civil War monocrop economy that was supported by cotton production in the South and tobacco production in the North, and launch a cotton mill campaign to both grow the cotton as well as produce it itself. However, this is ultimately a failure, and by the 1920s it's pretty evident that the free capital in the country had existed with northern investors and manufacturers who end up owning most of the wealth in the South, including the textile mills. And so this produces an interesting phenomenon in which the South becomes something like an internal colony. What ultimately ends up happening is, just like in the 1890s with imperialism, the North is going to extract resources from the South and continue to grow its own economy at the expense of poverty in southern mill towns. So what is this new South and how successful is it? Well, we see here in the map, in that old cotton growing region, cotton growing is still popular in the lower South that we see here in the green. And in the upper South in the red, tobacco is still the #1 crop there as well. Although there are a few more railroads built, and you do see some coal and iron mining, but some of that had even started to emerge before the Civil War. For African Americans, however, the story is a little more dire. The old Black Belt area, the Cotton Belt area of the lower South, is simply going to transfer slavery into the new cropling system, commonly just called sharecropping, in which most slaves, about 90% of former slaves, end up leasing land on the plantations they had been slaves on before the Civil War. So there's not much of a difference. We see these red areas where up to 80% of the farms are farmed by sharecroppers. And this is going to be a phenomenon that goes on well into the 20th century. Jim Crow laws are going to legally entrench this in the South for the next 100 years, and as whites legally segregated the South into two distinct societies, with separate penal codes for blacks and whites, separate facilities, spurred on by the decision in Plessy v. Ferguson that allows the doctrine of separate but equal to stand until Brown v. Board of Education in the 1950s. Really, the significance is that there's few significant economic or political changes in the South that are going to take place until well after the 1940s, and those are going to be long and hard fought. So what is life like in these southern tobacco and cotton mills that spring up? Most of them are white only, or else rigidly segregated. With the exception of the Knights of Labors, white workers generally protect their racial position, and African Americans are allowed only the lowest paying jobs, and African American women tend to typically work in domestic service in homes as maids and cooks. Wages are much lower for Southerners than outside of the region, which is only exacerbated by the widespread use of child and convict labor that really fuels a lot of these mills. And one region that's going to be really affected by this is the Piedmont region, kind of along the Appalachians, or what we called last year in the colonial United States, kind of like the backcountry areas that extends from southern Virginia all the way through northern Alabama. This is where most of the textile producing mills and small industrial towns are going to emerge. And farmers sent their children off into the mills to pay off their individual debts. Gradually, these move into company towns, reminiscent of like the Pullman towns and homestead towns, but even more centered around the mills, and even in some cases, like in West Virginia, the coal mines. Mill superintendents use teachers and clergy to inculcate the company's work ethic into the community, similar to the Lowell mills that we had studied in the early 19th century. In sum, though, what essentially is created is a somewhat industrial society. However, it's the industrial society of the early 19th century, wherein the North is raging into the late 19th century and even into the 20th century with the Second Industrial Revolution that moved beyond textile mills and into continuous production and scientific management. So ultimately, the New South idea is a failure on many levels. I told you we'd keep it short. We'll pick up next time with the very beginning of chapter 20.